Tutors or consultants, as we call them, don't touch the paper. They only ask questions, and they're only there to guide someone to the right answer. And that would be like a generalist. Like, I'm not going to correct your grammar. I'm not going to touch your paper. I'm only going to ask questions. So, and that's like one side, and that would be like very uber generalist. And then on the other side, you'd have like a specialist that's like, I'm an expert in Photoshop. Let me show you how to do Photoshop. And you need to go. And some people here, and that's what's great about the Writing Center, is you're going to find consultants that are very much on this side of the scale, and you're going to see consultants that are on this side of the scale, and you're going to see them kind of ebb and flow between those. And that's what being a good consultant is being able to analyze a situation and say, hey, this person really needs to see a concrete example. So this time I'm going to be a specialist and say, this is a really good example thesis, and this is why it's a good thesis. Whereas in another situation, you might see someone who's really close to getting a thesis, and it might be helpful to say, well, is this the most, is this specific enough for your thesis to make sense? And they're like, well, I don't know. And then you keep asking questions so they finally get there, and then they get it themselves. So when you're tutoring, you're going to have to kind of pick your side every day. So, does that make sense? So, oops, did I skip one? Oh no, one of my slides is missing. I'm going to have to generalize about the generalist approach because it's not in my slide presentation. So generalist is, like I said, is it's very hands-off. You're going to ask a lot of questions, and that's just kind of going to be your job. You're not going to take over the session. You're going to try and guide them to the right answer. And your argument would be, I don't need to know how to write, I don't need to know everything about this research paper on glucose. That's a thing. I don't need to know anything about glucose because I know what I know if this makes sense to me. Here's their thesis. Do they argue their thesis? Yes or no? And if they don't, then you can ask them questions to make that thesis better. And then, and I would say that our Writing Center as a whole would lean towards that approach, and I would say that most Writing Centers would lean to that generalist approach. And I think as a recommendation, I would start towards the generalist end when you first start consulting, just to see how that works, and then kind of venture over into the specialist side, because I think there's a lot of valuable things in being a generalist tutor, like especially having students find out the answers for themselves. So I would recommend starting at that end, but that's just me. So then there's specialist, and this is the argument that knowledge is needed to be an effective tutor. You have to know the conventions. So like for a resume, you need to know the conventions of a resume, and you'd be able to say, hey, this is not what a resume looks like. You need to do this in order to have a resume. In the argument, you need to be a good consultant for a science major. I need to understand science, or I need to be a science major. And we have examples of that here in the MSU Writing Center. I am a digital writing consultant, and what that means is I feel comfortable in my expertise in a few digital things like creating websites, Photoshop, and things like that, where if someone came to me and goes, I don't know how to do this, I don't know how to make this website work in this way, then I could put on my specialist hat and be like, this is what you need to do in order to make that. And then, did you have a question?
I have a question.
Yes.
About this specialist approach, I'm wondering if there's a pitfall when you're taking this approach, because sometimes you have a client who's writing a paper that you're so familiar with, a topic that you're so familiar with, and you have all the knowledge, not just the content, but all these technical part, the conventional parts. Would you be risking that taking away their authorship and you do too much work for them and you're getting too excited about the topic and
Yeah, and I think that's one of the better arguments for the generalist approach is that if you have someone in philosophy 101 and we have a doctorate student in philosophy here, and they're not nailing it, but you can't but you're doing this argument, you're not doing this argument, because a lot of, the right to learn that we talked about, a lot about that is they need to make mistakes in order to be effective, better writers. And the mission of the Writing Center is not to make better papers, but to make better writers. And I think that's a really important thing to understand, is that yes, the byproduct of coming to the Writing Center is often better papers, but that's not the goal. That's just kind of an added benefit. So never feel like if you know something that you don't want to push them to do things that they're not comfortable doing just so they get a better grade, because that's not your job. Your job is to help them understand writing conventions in order to be better writers. Is that a good answer?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even when I have my specialist hat on, when I'm telling someone how to do something in Photoshop, there's still questions that you should be asking from the generalist. Well, if you do this, if you edit the image in this way, what does that mean in terms of altering reality? Or what does that mean to, is that, ethical to alter the image in that way? What are you trying to present by doing it this way? There's still questions that you can make them think about things when you have your specialist hat on. I argue you should have the generalist hat and the specialist hat. So, does that make sense? Generalist versus specialist, any questions? Cool. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to tell you about is the Writing Mentor program here at MSU. And I think this is a really, really cool thing. And it's probably because it's one of my big research interests, but still, it's really cool. So, when I was talking about writing across the writing in the disciplines, this idea that you have people with specific knowledge that kind of guide you through writing. One of our, I wouldn't say it's a direct writing in the disciplines in that sense, but we are starting a writing mentor program here at MSU, and that's where you take Writing Center tutors, and instead of having them hang out in the Writing Center and having people come to them, they go into the classroom and they sit in on every lecture, and they're a part of the class, and then students come to them for writing help. Now, I've done it once, and I was in a packaging 485 class, so I don't have any packaging background, and this was a senior capstone course. But just by sitting in on the lectures, you kind of gain a little bit of the knowledge, and you're able to kind of be slightly more effective as a tutor in the disciplines sense. But what makes it really cool are kind of three things that I think make it really cool. Is when you are in the Writing Center, you get who comes to the Writing Center. It might be because they think they're a bad writer, or it might be because someone told them to come, but that's who you get, and that's what you get to work with. But when you're in embedded tutoring, you get to help every student, regardless of they think they're a good writer, bad writer, in the middle, or they don't even think about writing. And I think that's really cool, because there shouldn't be, but there's a stigmatism, does that make sense? There's there's a negative aura of coming to the Writing Center. If I come to the Writing Center, I need help with writing, I'm a bad writer. And for whatever reason, people don't like to do that. And that's not true. I come to the Writing Center all the time. I get help from my fellow co-workers all the time. So getting to help everyone is really interesting, just because you get to see people all throughout the writing process, and you get to work on different things. Another thing you get to do is you get to interact with faculty as a part of this, and you get to ask them about assignments, and you get to